An old black man with a sack walked into a Chase bank and said just 5 words that made the whole room laugh, until the laughter died in their throats. What began as a joke turned into a reckoning. Behind the tattered coat was a history long buried, and inside that bag, a truth too powerful to ignore. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the polished floors of the Chase Bank lobby. As the glass doors swung open with a soft hiss, heads turned, not in welcome but in hesitation. A black man, elderly, bent slightly at the shoulders, and wrapped in a thick brown coat stitched with patches of time, stepped inside. His silver hair curled in loose, unruly waves around a face marked by age and hardship. On his shoulder, a faded canvas bag hung heavy, weathered by years. His shoes, cracked and worn thin at the soles, whispered against the floor with every slow step forward. Behind the counter, a young teller glanced up and smirked, nudging her colleague. "Must have wandered in by mistake," she whispered, not softly enough. A middle-aged woman in designer sunglasses pulled her purse closer, eyes narrowing. Whispers rippled through the room like small cracks forming in ice, subtle, but spreading. The man said nothing. His steps were steady, unhurried. Every person in the lobby watched him, but no one moved. The security guard, tall, pale, built like a linebacker, stepped forward, hand brushing against his belt with instinctive caution. His name tag read Miller, and his expression said more than his silence ever could. Authority tinged with annoyance, calculation lined with condescension. The old man stopped at the center of the lobby. Slowly, he straightened his back, eyes calm, sharp, despite their years. For a moment, the room stood still, caught between confusion and ridicule. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with unmistakable clarity. "This bank is mine." Silence gripped the air for a heartbeat, then shattered beneath a wave of laughter. A scoff from a corner couch, a teller biting back a full-throated chuckle, customers exchanging glances, shaking heads, some smirking openly, others looking away, uncomfortable but not enough to intervene. The declaration was taken as delusion, as the absurd interruption of a wandering nobody. The security guard stepped closer. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave," he said, voice low but firm, the tone used for unruly guests who didn't understand their place. Elijah Kirby didn't flinch. He looked at the guard the same way one might study a rusted lock on a long-sealed door. Then, without another word, he set the heavy canvas bag down at his feet. His hand, wrinkled but steady, rested atop it. The laughter didn't fade completely, but it faltered. Something about the stillness in the man's posture, not defiance, not threat, but certainty, unsettled them. A few eyes lingered on the back. The manager, watching from a glass-walled office above, rose from his chair, a furrow forming between his brows. "I'm not here by mistake," Elijah said, quieter now but every syllable resonating. "I'm here to reclaim what was taken from me." Miller's jaw clenched, hand now hovering with more intention near his hip. "That's enough, sir." But Elijah didn't move. His presence was small in scale, but weighty in atmosphere. The room no longer laughed. It watched. The door behind him slowly closed, sealing a truth that had waited decades in silence. And as that truth began to breathe again, so did the tension in the air. Not as mockery now, but as the precursor to something no one in that room was prepared for. Stephen Miller stood firm, his bulky frame rigid in the center of the bank's marble floor, arms slightly apart as if bracing for resistance. His uniform was crisp, gun holster gleaming under the overhead lights, a visual promise of authority. His gaze, however, was sharpened not by duty but prejudice, already framing the moment as a disruption rather than an inquiry. He stepped closer to Elijah Kirby, the elderly man who had just declared ownership of the Chase Bank lobby, with a heavy sneer that curled at the edge of his mouth. "Hey, old man," Miller said, his voice low but laced with mockery. "This isn't a shelter. You've got no business here. Now I'm only going to ask once. Leave before I have to make you." All around, customers and employees pretended to be busy, typing, reading, staring blankly at their phones. No one stepped in, but all were listening. The laughter from moments before had drained into a cautious quiet. There was something different about the way Elijah stood, grounded like a tree weathered, but not broken. His canvas bag rested beside him on the floor, untouched. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elijah replied, his voice even, carrying a strange clarity that lingered in the room. "But trouble found me in this place a long time ago. I came to take back what was stolen." Stephen scoffed. "You're talking nonsense. This is a bank, not a courthouse." At that moment, the glass door to the upper office opened, and James Temp descended the steps. His suit was tailored, hair slicked into a precise part, face carefully neutral. The bank manager of Chase's Rockview branch had built his reputation on composure, not compassion. He moved through the lobby with purposeful speed, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" Temp asked, arriving at Stephen's side but not looking at Elijah directly. His tone wasn't concerned, it was annoyed, already assuming fault where it was most convenient. "This man walked in off the street and claimed the bank belongs to him," Stephen replied, folding his arms. "He won't leave." Temp finally turned to Elijah. His smile was thin, professional. "Sir, I understand you might be confused, but this isn't the kind of place you can walk into and make statements like that." Elijah looked him square in the eyes. "There's no confusion. I built this bank in 1948. My name is Elijah C.K. Kirby." Temp blinked once, his smile faltering only slightly before snapping back into place. "Sir, you're mistaken. The Matthews family founded this branch and has owned it since the beginning." Elijah bent slowly, opened the flap of his canvas bag, and pulled out a single item, a worn, yellowed leather ledger. The spine was cracked, the edges curled with age, but the words Chase Bank, 1948, were still visible. He didn't hand it over, he simply held it in the light. "This is proof," Elijah said quietly, "and there's more." Murmurs rippled through the lobby. A few customers edged closer. The tellers froze mid-transaction, staring. James Temp shifted his weight, clearing his throat as if to dissolve the tension. "Mr. Miller," he said, gesturing for Stephen to step back. "Let's not escalate this unnecessarily." Stephen hesitated, jaw clenched, but obeyed, though his eyes never left Elijah's hands. "Sir," Temp continued, keeping his voice low and controlled, "why don't you let me take a look at that notebook? Then we can resolve whatever misunderstanding you may have." "It's not a misunderstanding," Elijah answered, not moving. "It's a memory, and a lie that stood too long without challenge." Temp's professional calm wavered. His eyes flicked to the ledger, then to the watching crowd. He couldn't afford a scene, not in the middle of a weekday, not with phones already subtly raised. "We'll handle this privately," he said through a tightened smile. "Follow me to the office." Elijah didn't move. "I'll open it right here," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Let them all see what you've kept buried." James Temp looked around the room. For the first time he noticed the faces watching him. No longer amused, but intrigued. Even the ones who'd laughed earlier were now alert. The balance had shifted. This wasn't a man causing a disruption. This was a reckoning, and it had just begun. Elijah Kirby stood motionless in the center of the bank lobby, his hand resting gently on the worn canvas bag beside him. For a moment, time held its breath. The laughter, the judgmental stares, even Stephen Miller's posturing faded into a tense stillness. Elijah's fingers, aged but steady, tugged at the leather strap securing the flap. The air in the bank thickened with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. No one moved, but everyone watched. With slow deliberation, Elijah opened the bag and withdrew a thick, weather-worn book, its leather cover cracked and its corners curled. The faded embossing on the front read in flaking gold, "Chase Bank Ledger." He held it up, letting it catch the overhead light, as gasps scattered across the room. The laughter was gone. A weighted silence replaced it. "This," Elijah said, voice calm but resolute, "is the founding ledger of this bank. My name is in it. Elijah C.K. Kirby. I built this institution, alongside John Williams, and then I was erased." The words sliced through the still air. For a moment, no one responded. James Temp, standing behind the teller counter, suddenly looked less polished. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. His fingers twitched, unsure whether to call someone or step back. His carefully cultivated image of composure was cracking. Stephen Miller, ever the reactionary, stepped forward, squinting at the ledger as if the distance between them could clarify what his mind refused to accept. "Anyone can print a fake book," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction now. The gun on his belt was no longer a symbol of control. It just hung there, useless. Elijah didn't react to the murmurs. Instead, he turned a few delicate pages in the ledger, revealing handwritten entries, banking transactions in fountain pen ink, and a signature line bearing the names Elijah C.K. Kirby and John H. Williams beneath the first deposit records. A woman near the back, one of the older customers, adjusted her glasses and peered closer. That's not a replica, she said under her breath, barely audible but enough to stir others. A subtle shift in the room followed. Skepticism began to fracture. Curiosity bloomed into discomfort. James finally stepped forward, his expression unreadable but his movement stiff. "Sir," he said, voice straining to stay level, "I don't know where you got this, but Chase Bank's ownership has been documented for decades. The Matthews family stole it," Elijah interrupted softly, turning his gaze to James. "They and John Williams orchestrated the takeover. When I was removed, they scrubbed every trace of me from the records. The color of my skin made that possible. The silence of those in power made it permanent." His voice wasn't bitter, it was painfully factual, as though he'd spent years learning how to speak the truth without letting it shatter him. James's throat tightened. He looked at the open book again, then at the customers now gathering near the center of the lobby. Some had phones in their hands, though none dared lift them high to record. Not yet. They were caught in a moment that felt too fragile to disturb. "Do you expect us to believe this, without any legal proof?" James asked, though it sounded more like a plea than a challenge. "I brought that too," Elijah said, kneeling slowly beside the bag and removing a bundle of folded papers, tied together with a fraying cord. He untied them and placed them gently on the table beside the ledger. His fingers lingered on the documents for a moment before stepping back. "These are the original property filings. Transfer agreements I never signed. Correspondence with lawyers who never replied. Court rejections that came before the first hearing. If you know how to read history," he paused, looking directly at James, "you'll see that it was never about legality. It was about erasure." James hesitated. He picked up one of the documents, his eyes scanning quickly, then slower, his breath caught in his throat, as he saw his grandfather's signature, not on an ownership document, but on a denial, a record of appeal dismissed in. Behind James, Josh and Martin, the two tellers who had mocked Elijah earlier, stood frozen, guilt rippling across their faces. Martin looked away. Josh swallowed hard. Even Stephen was silent now, the flush of certainty draining from his face. "No one thought I'd ever come back," Elijah said quietly. "That time would swallow the truth. That age and poverty would make me easier to forget." A beat passed. He looked around the room, not at the executives or security guards, but at the customers, the staff, the passers-by. "But I didn't come to take revenge," he continued. "I came to remind you what was lost, and to show you that even when power is stolen, truth waits." The weight of his words sank into every corner of the lobby. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. James slowly placed the paper down, his hand trembling slightly. Everything he'd believed about the bank's legacy, its story, its foundation, it all sat on a table in front of him, rewritten in ink, older than him. "I'll need to have these verified," he finally said, though his tone had lost the condescension it once carried. "Officially, you do what you need to," Elijah nodded. "But understand, validation won't come from power, it'll come from proof, and I brought more than enough." James stepped back. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the man in control of the room. That role now belonged to the figure in tattered clothes, standing in the center with nothing but a bag full of forgotten pages, and the undeniable weight of truth. The ledger lay open like an unearthed relic on the bank table, its inked names and figures now breathing life into a history that had been silenced for over half a century. Elijah Kirby stood tall beside it, his presence no longer questioned but not yet fully accepted. The tension in the room hadn't dissolved. It had merely shifted from dismissal to disbelief. James Temp held one of the faded documents in his hand, his jaw clenched tight, his mind raced, scanning familiar signatures that no longer comforted him. But Elijah's voice, low and unwavering, cut through the weight of the moment, like a chisel against stone. "In 1948, I co-founded Chase Bank," Elijah said, his tone neither boastful nor bitter, just steady, factual. "John Williams and I shared everything. We built this institution from scratch, a vision of access and growth in a community that had never been welcomed at the financial table." His words were not grandiose, they were methodical, like he'd rehearsed them thousands of times in silence, waiting for anyone to finally listen. "I brought in the first investors," he continued. "I negotiated our early loans. I met with farmers, with business owners, with working-class families who'd never seen the inside of a bank. We didn't just open accounts, we opened possibilities." Around him, People watched with a cautious curiosity. Emily Carter, the youngest bank teller, stood near the edge of the lobby. Her hands were clasped, her eyes fixated. A few feet behind her, Josh and Martin hovered in place, visibly unsure whether to believe or retreat. But when success came, Elijah went on, so did the discomfort. Not mine, John's. The more we grew, the more eyes turned toward our partnership. And the more those eyes questioned how a black man could stand beside a white banker, as an equal. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the space. They didn't come with hoods or fire. They came with briefcases, with contracts, with lawyers. James shifted his weight uncomfortably, still holding the aged paper. Elijah's words were beginning to cast shadows across the walls he'd once trusted. They said it was best for stability, for investor confidence. Elijah said. John agreed, quietly. Behind my back, they rewrote documents, restructured leadership, created voting boards that I was never invited to join. And when I objected, when I showed up with my name, my equity, my vision, they removed me, completely, legally, efficiently. Stephen Miller leaned against a pillar now, his arms crossed tightly. There's no record of you, he said, his voice not as sharp as before but still laced with doubt. You think that just showing up with some papers means you're the founder of this bank? Elijah looked at him, not with anger, but something deeper, a kind of pity. That's exactly what they counted on, he replied, that you'd believe what was left behind, and not what was taken. He turned back to the bag, pulling out another folder. This is the appeal I filed in 1950. It never made it past the county clerk's desk. This, he added, lifting another sheet, is a signed affidavit from one of our early depositors, testifying that I was present for the opening. Here's my handwriting on the first mortgage application we ever approved. James stepped closer now, unable to mask the dread spreading across his face. He looked down at the documents. Elijah laid out, each one a small fragment of a narrative that had been missing from the bank's story for decades. And together they formed something undeniable. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Someone from the back of the lobby asked. A woman, curious, but cautious. I did, Elijah said. I knocked on doors. I wrote letters. I spoke to reporters, lawyers, banks in other towns. I walked into rooms like this and said the same words I said today. But back then, they didn't even laugh. They just escorted me out and shredded the paperwork behind me. His voice grew quieter, but it never lost its edge. Eventually, I stopped trying to be heard, and I started waiting to be remembered. There was a pause, long, still, electric. Why now? James finally asked, his voice rasping through the dry air. Elijah looked at him, and something flickered in his eyes, an emotion James couldn't quite name. Because I'm running out of time, Elijah answered plainly. But the truth isn't. He gently closed the ledger with both hands, resting them on the cover like one might with a Bible or a casket. You've spent your career protecting a legacy built on a lie. You didn't start it, Mr. Temp. But you're holding it. And today I placed the weight of that truth in your hands. No one dared speak. The documents between them had replaced decades of suspicion with something more tangible. Accountability. The moment had shifted from spectacle to reckoning. Stephen muttered under his breath, but didn't move. Even he could feel it now. This wasn't just an old man's fantasy. This was a legacy, suppressed and buried, and now unearthed with the care of someone who had held it in silence for more years than anyone in the room had been alive. Elijah straightened his spine, gazing out at the people who once doubted him and now couldn't look away. Some truths are too big to stay buried, he said, and some names won't stay forgotten. The room didn't applaud, it didn't cheer, it didn't need to. It simply listened. And that, for the first time, was enough. James Temp stood stiff behind the front desk, the ledger trembling slightly in his hands. His fingers, trained over years of banking decorum, hesitated with every page he turned. The old ink, the brittle paper, the unmistakable Chase Bank insignia. It was all too real, and yet it challenged everything he thought he knew about the institution he'd spent his life upholding. The silence in the lobby thickened, like the air had turned to fog. Customers, tellers, and employees stared in quiet disbelief, watching Temp read as if waiting for a verdict. Behind him, the bold signature of Elijah Kirby stared back from the ledger's front page, etched into history, yet erased from every wall, every plaque, every boardroom at Chase Bank. This doesn't make sense, Temp finally muttered, his voice brittle with denial. I've studied our archives. The founding records. These names were never there. Elijah stood calmly, his hands resting on the worn bag beside him. That's because someone didn't want them to be, he said plainly. When the Matthews family took over, they removed every trace. I've spent 5 decades watching my name be reduced to a rumor. Temp didn't reply. He just kept flipping. Faded contracts, mortgage drafts, founding shareholder lists. All of them bore Elijah's initials or his full name, sometimes in looping penmanship, sometimes typed under the title managing partner. Stephen Miller shifted from his post near the doorway, jaw tight, brow furrowed. He crossed his arms over his chest, his voice loud and dismissive. Anyone can age a piece of paper. Coffee stains and calligraphy don't prove a damn thing. Emily Carter, still standing near the side, flinched at Stephen's tone. Others glanced toward him, but no one spoke. It was as if the certainty in his voice had finally lost its edge. Elijah's expression didn't change. I expected doubt, he said, reaching again into his canvas bag. From it, he pulled another folder, its corners bent, its clasp barely holding. He placed it gently on the table, opening it with the same reverence one might reserve for sacred documents. These are notarized ownership documents filed in 1949. And this, he unfolded a smaller slip of paper, is the court's rejection notice from 1951. Dismissed without hearing. No explanation. No review. Temp's eyes scanned the rejection letter. He read it once, then twice. His fingers trembled slightly now, not just from shock, but from guilt. The language was polite, but chilling. The court does not find cause to proceed. Plaintiff's standing is insufficient. He looked up. They said you didn't have standing? They said I didn't exist, Elijah corrected. Stephen scoffed. You're telling me every executive, every board member for the last 50 years just went along with this? You expect us to believe no one ever spoke up? They didn't need to, Elijah replied. The truth was buried before most of them arrived. The lie was already neat, framed and hung in the lobby. Temp's face flushed. He didn't look up, but his grip on the folder tightened. He flipped to the back of the ledger again, landing on a page dated just weeks before the Matthews family officially acquired the bank. There it was, in faint ink. A board meeting summary, noting the transition of leadership due to internal incompatibilities. Next to it, scratched faintly in pencil, EKK removed from daily operation. Why did you keep all this? Someone asked from the crowd. A man in a business suit, possibly a customer, his tone not mocking, but curious. Why carry it all this time? Elijah's gaze met his without hesitation. Because paper outlasts memory. A hush fell again. No one knew how to respond to that. Stephen stepped forward, pointing at the ledger with a bitter edge. None of this proves fraud. There's no signature from anyone admitting guilt. No confession. You could have found this in an estate sale and made up the rest. I don't need their confession, Elijah said, quiet but firm. I have their silence. That's been loud enough for half a century. Emily looked at Temp, then at Stephen, then at Elijah. Her gaze lingered on the ledger. She stepped forward, barely a few feet from Elijah now. I've worked here 3 years, she said softly, almost to herself. I've read our training binder. It says Chase Bank was founded by the Matthews family in 1950. Nothing before that. No mention of partners. No mention of Kirby. Temp's head slowly rose, because they rewrote the beginning. Elijah nodded. History isn't always destroyed by fire. Sometimes it's just edited by omission. Temp closed the folder at last, his face pale and strained. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked at Elijah, a hint of something softer in his voice. I don't know what happens next, he said. But I know this, I can't unsee it now. Stephen grunted. So what? We just hand him the keys? We rewrite everything because a few old papers say so? No, Elijah said. You don't rewrite the past. You just stop pretending it never happened. For a beat, no one moved. No one breathed. The ledger closed now, sat in the center of the table. Heavy, solid, and undeniable. In that moment, denial didn't vanish, but it had been forced to blink. And that was the first step toward reckoning. The hush that had settled over the Chase Bank lobby was fragile. Thin ice stretched across a boiling surface. Elijah stood calmly in the center. The evidence laid out before him, but all eyes had shifted now, not to the worn documents, not to the yellowed bills, but to the tense figure gripping the holster at his waist. Stephen Miller's jaw was clenched tight, his breath heavy, chest rising in short, controlled bursts. His hand hovered near his gun, not yet drawn, but far too close. His eyes flicked toward James' temp, waiting for permission that wouldn't come. But he didn't need it. What he needed was control, and in this moment, control was slipping. "You've said enough," Stephen barked, stepping forward, the heel of his boot landing hard on the marble floor. "This is over." No one moved. Emily Carter's fingers trembled at the edge of the counter. Josh held his breath. A few customers took cautious steps backward, their eyes locked on Stephen's twitching fingers. James Temp stood behind the counter, staring at Elijah, then at Stephen. The manager's hands were frozen midair, palms open, his voice trapped in his throat. "Stephen," he said carefully, the edge of a warning already shaping in his tone. "Don't." But Stephen didn't hear it, or chose not to. "He doesn't belong here," Stephen snapped. "He's lying. He forged all of it. And you're just gonna let him ruin this bank?" Elijah didn't flinch. His expression remained steady, like he'd been here before. Maybe not in this exact room, but in rooms just like it. Rooms where truth met denial at gunpoint. "I haven't lied," Elijah said. "You just never expected to hear the truth from someone who looks like me." The words struck hard. Stephen's breath caught in his throat, and then the gun was drawn. It wasn't pointed. Not yet, but it was out. A collective gasp swept the room. Emily stepped back, nearly stumbling. Josh raised both hands instinctively. The murmur of voices died instantly. Even the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. Elijah stared at the gun. Not afraid, just disappointed. James stepped out from behind the desk, his movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing louder than the last in the suffocating silence. "Put it down," James said. Stephen didn't move. "He's threatening the future of this place. You saw those papers. Do you really believe him? After all we've built, you want to throw it away for him?" "He's not the one threatening anyone right now," James replied, his voice calm but firmer now. "You are." Stephen's eyes darted to James, then to the employees, then back to Elijah, who hadn't taken a step, hadn't raised a voice, hadn't even blinked since the gun was drawn. "This bank," Elijah said softly, "was built on my back. You don't get to call me a threat for coming to claim it." Stephen's hand shook slightly. He looked around for backup, but what he saw was silence. No one stepped forward. No one nodded in agreement. Even the customers, who minutes ago had laughed at Elijah's claim, now stood rooted in place, unsure but no longer mocking. James took another step forward, now directly between Elijah and the barrel of the gun. "Stephen," he said again, this time not as a manager but as a man drawing a line. "This stops now." A long pause. Stephen's eyes narrowed. "Do you even know what happens if we validate this story? If the Matthews family hears we let this get out? You think they'll just let you keep your job? But this place survives that fallout." James didn't waver. If what he's saying is true, then this place doesn't deserve to survive the way it is. Elijah's gaze remained fixed, quiet and knowing. There was no triumph in his eyes, just clarity. Stephen's grip finally faltered. He blinked. Then slowly, like a man caught halfway between orders and consequence, he lowered the gun. The weight of it returned to his holster with a dull click. The sound was deafening. Relief washed over the room in a silent, invisible wave. The tension didn't vanish. It shifted. It settled on James now. Stephen stepped back, his jaw still tight, but the heat in his face had faded to cold defeat. "You're going to regret this," he muttered. "Maybe," James said quietly, "but not as much as I'd regret staying silent." He turned back to Elijah, who gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod, recognition, respect, and something deeper. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. James took a deep breath and looked out at the employees, at Emily, Josh, the tellers, the silent customers. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice carrying more weight than ever before. "But what I do know is that we can't pretend we didn't hear the truth. Not anymore." Silence answered him, but it wasn't resistance. It was reception. The kind that follows a door unlocking after years of being shut. Elias stepped forward, gathering the old papers and folding them back into his canvas bag, slowly, with care, as though every slip of paper carried the gravity of his lost years. He looked around once before heading toward the exit. Not as a man defeated, not as a man chased out, but as someone who had finally made himself seen. Behind him, the marble floor stretched quiet and clear, like the storm had passed, But everyone inside knew something irreversible had happened. A gun had been drawn. But truth had held its ground. And now, for the first time in decades, the real story had begun. James Temp stood still, his mind caught in the storm between legacy and truth. His fingers trembled lightly around the frayed edges of Elijah's ledger, pages that bore not just history, but judgment. Around him, the air inside the Chase Bank lobby felt heavier than concrete. The gun had been lowered, the immediate danger past, but something more profound now demanded courage, moral reckoning. Stephen Miller stood a few feet away, his jaw set in stone, lips tight, anger simmering behind reddened eyes. But James wasn't looking at Stephen anymore. His eyes were on Elijah Kirby, the man whose quiet endurance had shaken the foundation of the place James had devoted his career to. James took a long breath, his voice barely audible at first. "I've read the documents," he said, lifting the ledger slightly for all to see. "The signatures match. The founding dates align. The transfers, they never included Elijah Kirby's name, because he was never allowed to sign anything after being erased." The words dropped like weights into the silent room. Emily Carter, still standing behind the counter, looked up sharply. Josh, now visibly shaken, turned to James, eyes wide. Customers exchanged glances, no longer mocking, no longer indifferent. James walked forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed the worn ledger back on the table in front of Elijah. "This institution has profited from silence," he said, louder now. "From lies buried beneath polished marble and prestige. I believed the Matthews family's version of this bank's history, because that's what I was taught. Because that's what was easy." Stephen scoffed. "You're going to throw everything away over one man's story." James turned to him, but there was no hesitation in his voice. "This isn't one man's story. This is a bank built with stolen dreams, sealed behind closed doors, and guarded by silence. That ends today." Then he looked around the room, scanning each face. If this bank wants to survive, it has to confront the truth of where it came from, and who it left behind. Elijah stood quietly, saying nothing, but his eyes locked on James's, with a gaze that carried the weight of years, of trials, of betrayals. And now finally, a glimmer of validation. Emily Carter was the first to move. She stepped out from behind the counter, walked across the lobby, and bent down. Carefully, she picked up one of the faded Chase Bank bills from 1948, still lying on the floor where Elijah had displayed them. Without a word, she placed it on the table beside the ledger. A soft rustle, a single motion, but the room stilled again. "I believe you, Mr. Kirby," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried. Josh followed. He moved hesitantly, shame burning in his cheeks, but he mirrored Emily's act. He too picked up a bill and laid it gently in front of Elijah. "I'm sorry," he whispered. More employees came forward, one by one. Some looked embarrassed, others resolute, but each picked up a piece of that long-forgotten history and laid it before the man who had waited decades to be seen. A quiet procession of remorse and recognition. Even some of the customers, once so dismissive, now looked on with softened expressions. A man in a blue suit stepped forward, clutching a folded receipt from his pocket, and placed it beside the bills, not as proof, but as a symbol, a gesture of solidarity. Stephen watched them, stunned, his grip slack at his sides. His authority, once sharp and unquestioned, had crumbled under the weight of collective conscience. James turned back to Elijah. "You came here today to reclaim what was yours. And while I can't undo the past, I can promise that your truth won't be silenced again. Not in this building. Not while I have a say." Elijah's eyes glistened, just slightly. He nodded once, a small motion that carried the depth of 50 years of resistance. James faced the room. "This is no longer about maintaining image. It's about earning back integrity. From this moment forward, Chase Bank begins the process of publicly acknowledging its true founding. There will be inquiries, legal consequences, but there will also be change." The lobby didn't erupt in applause. No one cheered, but the silence that followed was powerful. Solidarity formed without fanfare. Respect earned, not demanded. Elijah looked down at the notes piled in front of him. Tokens of restitution decades too late, but finally arriving. He gathered them gently, his hands steady, his breath slow. James turned to the staff once more. "If anyone wants to walk away, I won't stop you. But if you stay, we do this right." No one moved. Elijah, For the first time since stepping into the bank, allowed a faint smile, not one of victory, but of release, the kind that comes when a man no longer has to carry truth alone. And with that the reckoning truly began. The marble floor of Chase Bank's grand lobby had never known such stillness. Every polished tile, every glinting fixture, seemed to hold its breath. In that silence stood Elijah Kirby, tall despite the bend in his spine, steady despite the tremble in his hands. Before him sat a table, now layered with fragments of a truth too long buried. Yellowed ledgers, brittle contracts, and a fistful of faded banknotes, bearing the legacy of a name history had tried to erase. James Temp stood nearby, the weight of a decision still heavy on his shoulders. His voice had already crossed a line no one expected, a declaration that the bank could no longer pretend ignorance. But now the room waited. Not for Elijah, not for James, but for someone else to move. Emily Carter did. The youngest teller in the building, always polite, always quiet, stepped from behind the counter. Her navy blouse was too big at the shoulders, her ID badge swinging slightly with every step. But her face held none of the hesitation one might expect. She walked to the center of the room and knelt down to pick up a bill, the same aged currency everyone else had ignored or laughed at just an hour before. She carried it to the table and set it down beside the ledger, her hand lingering for a moment on the worn paper. Then she turned, looked at Elijah, and spoke, not loudly, but clearly. "I believe you, Mr. Kirby." The words sliced through the hush like sunlight parting clouds. Stephen Miller, still lingering at the side of the room, flinched slightly. His hand hovered over his belt, no longer near the holster, but not at ease. His jaw clenched, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. But Emily didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Elijah, steady, steeled. The shift had begun. Josh, who had earlier whispered cynicism to a coworker, now moved forward. His face was flushed, his lips tight as if pressing down regret. He picked up another bill, walked it to the table, and placed it beside Emily's. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, barely meeting Elijah's gaze. I shouldn't have judged." A woman in accounting followed, then another clerk. No one spoke at first. No grandstanding. Just simple, solemn steps forward, each one laying down a note, or offering a nod of apology, each act echoing louder than anything Stephen could have shouted. One by one, the staff members, young, old, cautious, bold, came forward. The teller who had laughed, the assistant manager who had pretended not to see, even the janitor who had paused mid-mop in the hallway. They all laid something down. A note, a receipt, a folded corner of institutional memory they could no longer ignore. James watched it unfold in real time, his team not acting out of pressure, but from the slow build of conscience. Each gesture was a whisper of accountability becoming a chorus. The customers didn't move right away. Many still stood in silence. Some clutched their phones in frozen fingers, but their eyes began to soften. What once was mockery had turned to uncertainty. Then, from the back of the room, an older man in a gray overcoat approached the table. He placed a crisp $20 bill on the ledger and stepped back. "I don't know everything," he said quietly, "but I know a man telling the truth when I see one." Stephen could no longer stand still. He took a sharp breath, jaw tight, and stepped forward. "What are you all doing?" he barked, voice strained, brittle. "You're siding with someone who showed up off the street. No proof, just a story." Emily turned to him. For the first time, her voice didn't tremble. "He brought more than a story. He brought the truth. You just didn't want to hear it." A low murmur rippled through the lobby, not angry, not loud, but full of tension finally being released. Stephen looked around. No one moved to back him. His position of strength was crumbling beneath his boots, not from confrontation, but from disconnection. What had once felt like control now looked like isolation. "You're making a mistake," he said to James, his voice quieter now, less sure. "The Matthews family won't forget this." James's reply came steady. "Let them remember it. Let everyone remember it." He turned to Elijah, then gestured to the bank's staff and customers gathered nearby. "This isn't just about one man reclaiming his story. This is about all of us deciding whether we stand with what's right or hide behind silence." Elijah looked around the room, emotion flickering in his gaze. For so long, he had walked this path alone. Now the weight began to shift. Not erased, not forgotten, but no longer solely his to carry. The bills on the table were still old, still faded, But they now meant something different. They were no longer relics of a stolen legacy. They were symbols of recognition. Stephen stood at the edge of the room, still watching. But even he knew the tide had turned. The room no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to truth. And as Elijah gently placed a hand on the ledger, his ledger, it was clear. Silence had been broken. Belief had gathered. And history, at last, had a witness. The lobby doors of Chase Bank closed softly behind Elijah Kirby. But inside, the silence was anything but ordinary. No longer was it the silence of dismissal, or of disbelief. It had shifted into something deeper, reverent, reflective, the kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but presence, the kind of silence born when truth leaves its mark. James Temp stood still near the center of the lobby, eyes fixed on the place where Elijah had just exited. In his hands remained the old yellowed documents, legal records, bank ledgers, and written proof of a story that could no longer be denied. Around him, the employees stood in quiet solidarity, some with heads bowed, others staring ahead, uncertain but awakened. Emily Carter lingered near the table, fingertips brushing the faded banknotes gently. What moments ago had been nothing more than fragments of the past, now lay like symbols of a reclaimed future. Josh stood beside her, no longer hiding his regret, no longer hiding at all. James finally exhaled and turned to face the staff. "We're not hiding this," he said with quiet authority. "This goes to the executive board today." There was no applause, no cheer, just nods, quiet conviction. Everyone knew what that meant. James would be challenging a power older than his own tenure, older than even the careers of those who had built their lives within the bank's halls. He would be standing against the Matthews family owners in name, but not in truth. Within the hour, James was in his office, digitizing the evidence. Scanned pages of the original 1948 ledger, notarized contracts with Elijah's name, timelines that showed the erasure piece by piece. He attached every document to an internal email marked Urgent Legacy Discovery, full review requested. Then, before hitting send, he typed a subject line he hadn't expected to write in his entire career: Founder Reinstatement Inquiry, Elijah C.K. Kirby. The message shot through the bank's executive web like lightning. By midday, news of the incident had already leaked beyond the building's walls. Someone had posted a photo of Elijah holding the ledger, and it had spread like a spark catching dry timber. At first it was just Rockview locals, then reporters, then historians, then attorneys. Before the bank's PR team could prepare a statement, articles were already forming around keywords like stolen legacy, racial erasure, and founder denied. Back in the community, conversations started bubbling in cafes and schools. People who had never thought twice about the name above the marble doors were now asking hard questions. Teachers used Elijah's story to discuss systemic bias. Local leaders began drafting resolutions to investigate Chase Bank's history. A movement had started not with protest, but with proof. Elijah, meanwhile, returned to his small apartment tucked above a quiet corner grocery on East Hanover. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't check social media. He placed the ledger in a fireproof safe beneath his bed, brewed himself a cup of black tea, and sat at the window where the sunlight pooled over the floorboards. For the first time in over 50 years, he wasn't carrying the weight of truth alone. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived at the door, hand-delivered and sealed with the Chase Bank crest. Inside, a single line handwritten beneath the letterhead: "We request your presence at the upcoming executive session. A seat has been prepared in your name." Elijah read the note in full silence. Then, quietly, he folded the page and placed it beside his tea. He didn't smile, not fully. It wasn't joy he felt. It was confirmation that what had been stolen might now begin to return. Back at the bank, Stephen Miller submitted his resignation. It wasn't dramatic. No final words or grand gestures. He simply left his badge on the desk, walked out the back door, and disappeared into the noise of a city beginning to shift. Some said they saw him sitting alone that evening, head down, finally reckoning with what he'd tried to enforce. Meanwhile, James stood before the executive board. The room was cold with denial. The Matthews representative, stern and tight-lipped, questioned every line of Elijah's documents. But the signatures matched. The ink was real, the narrative undeniable, and more importantly, the court of public opinion had already begun its trial. By week's end, Chase Bank had launched a formal investigation into its founding history. The board authorized a public statement acknowledging credible claims of historic misconduct and exclusion. James was named interim head of a new legacy equity division, its mission to identify, recognize, and restore contributions of those historically erased. And while the legal process would be long, something more immediate had already changed. At the front of Chase Bank's lobby, where a digital screen once displayed ads for savings accounts, now played a silent loop of a new image: Elijah Kirby, standing tall beside the original 1948 ledger, his name etched below as founder and visionary. Customers paused to read. Staff nodded as they passed. What had once been invisible was now undeniable. Elijah didn't seek applause, but he didn't walk in shadows anymore. His story, once buried beneath stone and silence, now echoed through every corner of the institution that once denied him. Justice had arrived, not in rage, but in revelation. And this time the world was watching. If this story stirred something real in you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who still believes truth has no expiration date. Let this be more than a moment. Let it spark a conversation where legacy, justice, and dignity are front and center. Because the past doesn't just whisper, it teaches. Are you listening?